Hello, everyone, and welcome to another members-only live stream edition. I am Glenn, and today we're going to be talking about political cartoons, and not just any of them, but those of perhaps the most famous political cartoonist, Thomas Nast. Now, we all, I think it's safe to say, have seen political cartoons in our time, clear up to the present day, and they always seem to make an impact. They're witty, they're partisan, they're biased. Sometimes they're sad and heart-moving, but really, every political cartoon that we have today can thank who's been called the father of political cartoons, Thomas Nast. Well, who was this fellow? We've got a great program, and we're going to be talking to some experts a little later on. But let me look at my notes and make sure I can tell you these facts and dates and figures. Most importantly, he was born in Landau, Germany. He is actually of Bavarian descent. When he was 4 years old, his family came to New York, to America and New York, because his father did not necessarily hold with the Bavarian government, so he had to get out. And Nast eventually began attending public school from age about 6 to 14, where he did not do very well at his subjects. He was a rather poor student, except, unsurprisingly, for his drawing ability. He loved drawing, and he actually went and studied with some formal illustrators a little later on, and everyone could see this raw talent that this fella had. And so when he was only 18, he was hired by Harper's Weekly magazine. You can see a picture of Harper's Weekly in the next slide in 1859. And let me pause here just for a second and tell you a little bit about Harper's Weekly. Harper's Weekly was a magazine. Now, don't think of a modern magazine with slick color pictures and pages and things like that. It's not quite the same thing. It was a more dense, more general audience publication, different from a newspaper. A newspaper is going to literally have only the news of the day and ads for runaway slaves at this time or for goods just coming in on a ship and things like that. A magazine is going to have a more general interest, and it's going to have articles about different things, politics of the day. It's going to be able, because it's not published as frequently as a newspaper, to have illustrations like the one you see here. This, and Harper's Weekly really becomes one of the most prominent, important, influential, and informative publications during the American Civil War. And as I said, Nast comes on board in 1859, just in time to get involved with the effort. So this issue we have of Harper's Weekly here is showing some of the production in the northern factories. The Harper's Weekly is very much a pro-Republican, pro-progressive magazine. It is in favor of the Republican viewpoint, of emancipation and things like that. And so when Nast comes on board, he sort of goes along with and shares that. And you can see in the next slide some of the work that he does for Harper's Weekly. This is one of his most famous wartime illustrations, not a cartoon per se, but you can see the artistic quality that he's operating with just as a very new published illustrator. You've got an image of a soldier on the front, sort of looking at the fire, and juxtaposed with that is presumably his sweetheart or his wife with the children in the bed. She is praying at the window, sort of looking out at the same moon that shines down upon him. This is very much a pull on the heartstrings kind of thing, and this was an incredibly popular image. This image was often paired, when possible in camps, with the famous Civil War song, "There's No Place Like Home," or "Home Sweet Home." And that was the most popular song on both sides during the war. Now, Nast is not just doing the sentimental stuff. He's also involved with some of the most pressing wartime and political issues of the day. On the next slide, you can see his take on Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, proclaimed in 1862, but it doesn't take effect until January 1st. That's when this illustration is in the first week's issue of Harper's Weekly for 1863, and you can see it's got centered a recently emancipated family. They're living together. It shows some of the struggles they've had, some of the hopes that they have, but this is Nast's sort of compilation of exactly what he hopes emancipation will be. He's very forward-minded and progressive, believes in the equality of races. But as the war goes on and slowly starts to finally come to an end, Nast sees, like many strong pro-Republican supporters, that perhaps the government, after the assassination of Lincoln and with Andrew Johnson in power, is going to be a little bit too conciliatory. And so in this next slide, you can see a series, the first of a series of illustrations that Nast does trying to reflect upon this. And you can see this is the North compromising with the South. He thinks this is an absolute abomination. He's moving from sort of just illustration, which you saw in those first two, to more what we think of as a political cartoon. There are themes within it that are trying to express political ideas. Here you see the Union veteran without a leg, his head hung low in shame, the United States flag upside down to show distress, and he's asking, why are we compromising with the defeated South and all of their bad ideas? Even though you see the Southern soldier over here has his sword broken, he is upstanding, he is proud. He has his foot on the grave of Union soldiers, and there is Lady Columbia, who at this time period very much represents the United States, is weeping at the grave of that Northern soldier, and the background is just in absolute ruin. The North, even though it's won the war, seems to be giving up everything that they had sacrificed blood and treasure for. Nast does not like this. Many Republicans do not like this. And it goes even further. On the next slide, you can see as Reconstruction government start. This one is called basically, the era of the white man. The central figure is the former Confederacy. It even has a CSA there on its belt buckle. You have the Northern Democrats to the Confederates' left, and to the right, you have a very sad caricature of what he considers the ignorant white voting masses in the North who, and remember, the North was often anti-slavery, always pro-union, but very often not anti-racism. Racism was unfortunately almost as rampant in the North as it was in the South. The common white men were afraid that recently freed African Americans were going to come north, take their jobs, and this cartoon is basically poking fun of the establishment that is being created. And you can see not only the recently enslaved, but we have here a member of the U.S. colored troops, an African American who has actually put on the uniform and fought for the Union, the flag being trampled in the dust, their feet upon this once brave veteran is being given up. And here at the very bottom corner, something that we're going to see a little bit later, this is a ballot box. So the ballot box has been totally cast aside, anything resembling a fair vote. Thomas Nast is representing this new South that is coming out of Reconstruction. And of course, one of the things that does come out of Reconstruction, especially later on, are a lot of groups that are working together to suppress the recently freed African Americans socially, economically, and politically. In the next slide, you can see this theme of Nast that carries on, sort of these bad guys clasping hands, and this is perhaps the most telling of all. You have on the left there the White League, the former Confederates that you can't see their face, but you can see that they are armed and they're trying to make a deal, a death deal, right, with the Lost Cause, and create a union as it was with the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan, which was established to suppress not only black voting, but black independence and prosperity. And they are there. You can see the black family, the schoolhouse is being burned. They're being harmed. They're being pressed back down because of this new union in the South. And this is the time that Nast is writing in. There's a lot of turmoil in the country, not just because of the Civil War. The Civil War ends in 1865, but Reconstruction during the Grant administration is not going very well for the recently freed African Americans. The former folks who had power in the South, the Redeemers and the Bourbons, have come back to power and are beginning to put systems in place such as Jim Crow and sharecropping and things like that are going to make conditions terrible for the African Americans. And you can even see a little motto on the shield there: worse than slavery. I'm not sure if the formerly enslaved folks would agree with that, but suffice to say, it was not what they were promised, especially those who had voted for the Republicans and who had fought in the war. But there were bright spots to Reconstruction that Nast realized, especially early on. In the next slide, you can see an image that I've actually chosen as our background, the ballot box. And this is also has some neat juxtapositions. You can see to the left the former Confederates and the Northern Democrats. That's Andrew Johnson there trying to veto the 15th Amendment, which granted all men, the right to vote, regardless of race. You can see the staunch Northern ally, supposedly Grant there, sort of interposed between those people and the voting former soldier, African American. And you can see again that ballot box. What that is, we're not familiar with a ballot box that looks like this, but it's a wooden frame with a large clear glass bowl so that you can see the people putting the votes in. You can see that they're actually voting, but you can't see who they're voting for. That's a very common ballot box. So Nast sees that perhaps there are opportunities for African Americans to succeed in Reconstruction. Remember, they do get the vote. They do get, there's even a lieutenant governor in one of the southern states. There are several African Americans that go to the Senate and the House of Representatives for the U.S. government early on in Reconstruction, but it eventually starts to fall apart. And ironically, one of the things Nast blames for this are carpetbaggers. You can see in the next slide, this is one of his most famous, many of you will probably recognize this image by Nast. This sort of represents the carpetbagger who's coming south, and it presents a very negative view of the North amongst Southerners. Basically, Nast says we need to reconstruct the South, but we don't need to trample on them and make them hate us, which is what this type of carpetbagger is. He's carrying all the sins of the South there in front, but he's ignoring the sins from the North that carry on. With the combination of carpetbaggers and the corruption in the Grant administration, Nast eventually just starts to sort of give up on the idea of Reconstruction and the fact that it could work. And so in this next cartoon, you can see this is his image of what Congress was with African Americans there. Not a very flattering caricature, but he does start to see that things are not going well, that there's infighting in the North, that Congress is not working the way it should, that the Senate, especially in the House of Representatives, is not working as it should. And eventually he, like much of the country, sort of gives up on the hope of what Reconstruction will be. And by 1877, with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, a Reconstruction in the South ends, and it sort of goes its own way. And from that point on, Nast becomes less interested in a Reconstruction South and what should provide racial equality and stability in the South. And he started, by that point, to focus on things closer to home. He came to New York. He lived in New York for almost all of his life, and so he's very closely tied. And New York has several different things going on at this time. One of them, of course, has been the huge influx of Irish immigrants. And in the next image, you can see that Nast, though he is the father of modern political cartoons, is not above caricatures of pretty much everyone. This is an Irishman who you can see is drunk. He is sitting on a gunpowder barrel and is basically protesting for his rights, but in his drunken stupor and madness is about to light the gunpowder in the barrel and blow himself to bits. Basically a commentary that perhaps the Irish are not very well qualified to be citizens or to be voters. And you can see on the next slide that Nast sees this conundrum for American democracy, the balance scales, the South versus the North, the recently freed enslaved voters versus the ignorant white voters in the North. He hopes will balance out, and that smoother, cleaner, more knowledgeable heads will prevail. As I said, he starts to get away from this theme, and he moves to something different. There is, as we move from Reconstruction, we go into something that's the beginning of what's called the Gilded Age, a time period of big booming business in the country. And Nast sees this corruption and decides that this is going to be his new crusade. And so on the next slide, you can see something that makes the cover of Harper's Weekly. He has been sentenced to hard labor by the corruption. In other words, he is sharpening his pencil, and there will be no shortage of Nast cartoons coming up. And he starts to take aim at both the Democrats and the Republicans wherever he sees what he considers corruption or poor leadership. And in the next slide, you can see something that continues to stick with us. A couple of different cartoons he's done. Nast really can be credited with the creation of the donkey as the symbol for the Democratic Party and the elephant for the symbol of the Republican Party. From these two cartoons, he sort of kicks that off. Ha ha. Notice my pun, if you will. And those two symbols start to stick even up to our present day. They're just a quick, at a glance, cartoonist ability to say this is one political party, this is the other, and Nast really sets that off. But as I said, he comes back to New York, and New York has what he considers a vast problem, perhaps one of the great dangers of democracy when you have a cult of personality, a very corrupt person in charge of a major city and its political machines. I speak, of course, of Boss Tweed. And we have here next an image of Boss Tweed, an actual photograph. Not a terrible looking man, but ripe for caricature. And Nast is vehemently against his political machine. Boss Tweed sort of stationed himself. His organization was called Tammany Hall, after a group that had been in New York really since just after the American Revolution, but which he sort of took over and named for his political machine. He never really held national office, but what he did is he took taxpayer money and then began to purchase, buy, bribe elections, the state and city legislatures, the courts, and he embezzled so much money. We're not even sure today how much money his organization took. It's somewhere, and this is in like 1870s dollars, somewhere between $20 million and $200 million in taxpayer money that he took and reconstituted to different ends. And really, he gets involved in New York politics before the American Civil War, but it really kicks in the middle of Reconstruction in 1868. And on the next slide, you can see where Nast has begun to do cartoons of Boss Tweed. And our two speakers are going to speak to this a good bit a little later. But you can see in this first cartoon, the one in front, Tweed, basically the brains is really just money. He has taken money, and this is a great caricature. And then down here, he's got two little kids. He's showing him the rules of living, the two kids' rules of living in New York according to Boss Tweed. And Boss Tweed hated Thomas Nast because it was making him look very bad, and it was exposing the corruption in a way not many people had the courage to do, and it was doing it in a very clever, very populist way. On the next slide, you can see another one of Nast's cartoons having to do with Boss Tweed. Who stole people's money? And everyone is sort of pointing to Boss Tweed. You can see this entire corrupt circle of toadies and politicians, but they all seem to be pointing to Boss Tweed. And you can see, again, Nast has got Tweed down pretty well. Tweed eventually is brought to justice. He's convicted of embezzlement and things like that. He goes to jail. He actually escapes from jail thanks to some of his cronies. And in the next slide, this is very interesting. So when Tweed escapes from jail and makes his way to Spain, actually, Nast portrays him and his cronies as jailbirds. They're vultures that have still picked on the dead, and they're trying to escape justice. Ironically, so Boss Tweed disappears into a foreign country, and it's one of Nast's cartoons, and one of our speakers will mention this later. Someone recognizes him from one of Nast's cartoons and turns him in. This is the cartoon that they recognize him from, and he ends up going back to the States, going back to jail, and he dies in jail in 1878. So much for Boss Tweed. Now, it's not just political corruption. As Nast's career goes on, he becomes well known for a lot of different things. Perhaps one of the most significant to our everyday lives, or at least our once-a-year lives, is the idea of Santa Claus. And here on this next slide, you can see just 3 images of Nast's portrayal of Santa Claus. And this is going to look very familiar to everyone. He sort of starts to set the tone. Remember, he is German or Bavarian in origin, and so he's bringing the legends of Saint Nicholas over with him, and that's stuck in his head. His parents are going to reinforce that, so he begins these drawings to show Santa Claus, and this starts the trend in the United States of what we think of as Santa Claus. He's bringing toys. He's dressed in red. He's fat and jolly. He has these white whiskers and hair, and if you'll see the one right above me here, he's even got a sleigh, and he's sitting on top of a chimney. Right? So many of these legends, Nast really starts to develop, and it's him that popularizes so many of these things that we think of. Now, Nast does go on. His style sort of goes away with the way the medium changes, the way the business and industry changes. He doesn't have as much work anymore. He gets in financial trouble. He tries to start his own magazine. It doesn't go very well. But Theodore Roosevelt, when he is president, steps in. He's very much an admirer of Nast, and he appoints him to be a consul to Ecuador on behalf of the United States. And there is a yellow fever epidemic that sweeps through Ecuador, and Thomas Nast catches yellow fever. He helps several other people escape the plague, but he does not, and he actually dies there in Ecuador. And he is brought back and buried in his own beloved New York City. So that is the History Center's take on Nast, but we have decided to bring some folks in to give a little bit more context about what political cartoons are, why they're significant, and why Nast, even today, stands head and shoulders above the rest. Our first guest is Dr. Mark Summers. Dr. Summers has spent a lifetime studying political cartoons and studying the effects of political cartoons on the political process. So let's hear from Dr. Summers.
My name is Mark Summers. I'm an historian at the University of Kentucky. I teach American history and anything else they let me get away with. I've done Civil War and Reconstruction, Gilded Age, period before, even once taught a course on the history of political cartoons. Generally, I find whatever I teach ends up being the thing I'm enjoying the most at the time. So,
so many people get interested in history because of, for lack of a better word, fun stuff like cartoons or like costumes or like movies or something like that. But they're very serious. They continue to be very serious. They're a way that people can express particular political views in early America. Well, maybe not super early America, but say you're talking about the mid-19th to the late 19th century. What role did they really serve, and how did people consume them?
Well, they're kind of a big deal. Early on, say in the time of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, political cartoons are few and far between. They're engraved on copper plate and then they're printed off, which means you'd have to go to a store to buy one. And most of the events that are happening, there's no cartoons about at all. You really need to have a mass readership for that. By the 1830s or 20s, when people had made politics the number one spectator sport in the country, you have the political parties putting out cartoons every election year. In lithographic form, just sort of broadcasting tons of them that people could buy cheaply. But by around the 1860s, your cartoons are beginning to appear regularly in mass media periodicals, Harper's Weekly being a case in point, Leslie's Weekly being another. And so by that time, people are actually beginning to absorb cartoons about whatever events are really happening and reading them. Newspapers didn't have cartoons. They didn't know how to print them until the 1890s. It's only in, about the mid 1890s that all at once you have a cartoon of the day. And it's so important that in almost every case, the cartoon's going to be on the front page. It's probably, if there's nothing else on the front page, no other illustration, there's going to be a political cartoon. That kind of tells what their importance is, I think.
As far as the cartoons being such a popular part of the newspapers, like you're talking about, did the politics drive that more than the new technologies of printing and mass media? Was it a perfect storm of everything? What really drove that?
What really drives the cartoons to come into newspapers as opposed to magazines is that by the 1890s, newspapers can actually print some kind of illustrations. Now, you look, say, in the 1850s or 60s, all you're going to get is print. I mean, that's it. Illustrations, pictures of any kind just aren't going to be there. But by the 1890s, with the mass media print, you can actually have artists on staff that can draw pictures of events, but they can also give people a picture of the day of what's going on, what the most important issue is. So the technology confines and limits people. If you're in the 1860s, for example, the only way you could do a cartoon is for an illustrated magazine, where essentially what happens is the artist is going to have to use a pencil on a wood block and draw the pencil lines there. Then they send it off to an engraver, a wood engraver, who's going to cut ridges and the rest that the ink can go in that they can print in the magazine. By the 1880s, what they're beginning to do is something that was already being done in places like France. They're doing it with lithographic stones, where you're using kind of grease pencils and then adding on colored ink to make a color cartoon that will appear every week, one on the front cover, one on the back cover, and then a 2-page spread right in the middle. So the technology makes all the difference in how you can spread this stuff, which is, of course, why I say in the 1790s and so on, there aren't very many cartoons, because the only way you can do it is with somebody actually cutting something into a copper plate, and then that copper plate, having ink into the ridges and the rest, and the fissures and cuts, and then print those. And you can print on that. You can do what, maybe 200 at most, maybe 300 at most, before all the lines get kind of fuzzy. So, and the only buyers you got are people that can go to a shop that's selling them, which means you have to have a major sized city to be able to make any of these cartoons at all. Philadelphia can do it, maybe New York, but nowhere else in the country. So cartoons are really limited by the kind of technology you can use. And that's why, for example, in England or in France, political cartooning is way ahead of us until the 1860s, because London is big, Paris is big. You can get an audience for people that way. In America, where your biggest city is maybe 10,000 people, you don't have the audience you need. It's just not going to be there.
Segue perfectly, talking about political cartoons in Paris and London and Europe. We here in America always have prided ourselves on that vicious First Amendment and being able to say and do anything. Is there a different flavor to American political cartoons, say, compared to those in Europe?
Well, if you're talking in the 1780s and 90s and the rest, our cartoons are cleaner. They're less likely to be scatological or have various bodily functions that we don't want to think about or talk about, but that's because there's so few of them. So there is a difference. There's also a difference in the fact that, England's level of free speech and free press is sufficient. Then you can have any number of cartoons that are positively libelous and vicious in the 1700s, as long as you don't mention the person by name. What you do is it will be it'll be things like the Duke of N, and then a long blank, and then an E at the end, and everybody knows it's the Duke of Newcastle. Of course they know that, but you haven't put down the name, so they can't catch you for libel. I mean, and you can have any number of things like that. And by the 1790s in England, you've got about the most robust cartoon culture that you're going to find, with absolutely brilliant artists out there doing really, really vicious and nasty work. James Gilray, for example, is just very talented. George Cruikshank, Robert Cruikshank, Isaac Cruikshank, all of those. There's this enormous kind of sort of print media of these sort of incredible prints that are being sent and transformed out there. And you go to France, and you're going to find the same thing happening when they've got the freedom to do it. You go in the 1830s, and you've got a tax on the king, a man by the name of Louis Philippe, and a magazine, Le Caricature, and later Charivari, they have artists who have realized that the king's face and form looks very much like a pear, and they caricature him as a gigantic walking pear. I mean, it's one of the few times that a piece of fruit has become an act of libel out there, and they're able to do it until the laws are changed and they get indicted and thrown in jail for it. So it makes a difference. But while those cartoons are coming out, they're more vicious and ferocious than anything you see in this country, and they're really, really good. They're quite wonderful. It's a very good art form.
Most people who look at historic political cartoons or modern political cartoons can see that they are attacking. They are usually in the negative. They are critical. They tend to simplify it perhaps too much. They tend to tear down rather than build up. Is that because of the medium? Is that because human nature? Is that because political cartoons are inherently anti-politics? What's the oomph of that?
All you have to do is look at your newspaper. If you have a banner headline going across it that said nothing particularly significant happened today, how many people do you think would buy the newspaper? Well, it's the same kind of thing with cartoons out there. If you have cartoons that say, give a pat on the back, Calvin Coolidge, you are one of America's great citizens out there, nobody's going to much care. They want to look at a cartoon in large part to laugh or to see a point distilled about what's going wrong that needs to be fixed. So cartoons by their nature are going to have to be, to some extent, negative, or the cartoonist just isn't going to provoke anybody's interest. It's just not going to happen. But the fact of the matter is, cartoons can go all the way from vicious to very genial and often very, very funny, and quite charming. And cartoonists have varied all along the spectrum. They're that way. Some of them are filled with great anger about things going wrong. Others of them just see the whole passing show as a comedy. And they treat it that way, whimsically and with humor.
Mm-hmm.
I would caution that, in fact, many of the cartoonists that have lasted the longest are the ones that, in fact, see things as funny, because cartoons that are always angry, furious, enraged are going to tire people out. And they're just not going to want to do it after a while. They get worn down by them.
The evolution of political cartoons within an artist's lifetime, of course, evolves. And looking at the history of the entire nation of the United States over time, the political cartoons definitely evolve too. You know, I'm thinking specifically of maybe some of those cartoons from the Jackson administration. And I know the ones you're thinking of, and there's serpents and there's Jackson and there's different people and there's about 15 different word bubbles and there's so much text. And then you get to modern political cartoons and it's a single color frame on a piece of newsprint. And the point is like there, you know, it's one single point that doesn't try to connect a lot of complex things. It's just got that one point it hones in on. And that is, I mean, we're talking about a long-term evolution. Is that just the American political scene? Is that the evolution of the American political consumer? What's, you know, kind of sum that up in a nutshell, if you can. I know that's incredibly difficult.
It's partly the media. If the media you're using, the kind of form you have. You talk about those lithographs. Those lithographs of the Jackson administration have all those bubbles and the rest, because very often people are going to hold on to that cartoon. They have to buy it in the first place, even if it's relatively cheap. And if they're probably going to keep it, they may well frame it. They may keep it for other days. It's not something you basically just throw away. So, in fact, you can spend a long time looking it over and begin to get some of the points or catch some of the jokes in it. Even though just about everybody in those cartoons looks like they go to the same tailor, you know, with different heads put on them. I mean, that's the difference that Thomas Nast is doing. I'll talk about that in a minute in terms of evolving. But you got a newspaper cartoon. One of them's coming out every day. And the best estimate is that a person is going to look at that cartoon for maybe up to 6 seconds. And after that, it's gone. If it hasn't made its point, they're not going to spend their time looking through the complicated text and and textuality of it. If you had a Gilray cartoon, it would probably take him 2-3 days to draw it. Your political cartoonist there has just a few hours to dash the stuff off on paper, and he's not given much space to put the stuff. So it means, in fact, that you've got to have a cartoon that makes its point really, really fast, because people aren't going to waste time trying to look it over, and they're not going to keep the cartoon. Makes a great deal of difference. I mentioned the other thing about Nast again, which is, if you look at the cartoons from the 1830s or 40s, the people that you see there, well, yeah, Andrew Jackson looks like Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren looks like Martin Van Buren, but they're all cartoons done almost as if they're by gentlemen for gentlemen in terms of the visual face. And the bodies, as I said, they all dress the same way. You look at Nast, and what you see is something very different. He's not doing a caricature of a face. He's putting the character of the person into the face. So you can tell what kind of human being that character is. And you have a sense, not just from the face itself, but the way they dress, the way their posture is, what kind of person they are. I mean, he's one of those kind of people. The striking thing is that even if you can't see the whole face, you know who you're looking at. All you need to do is look at the eyes out there, or maybe, see them from behind, and you know exactly who it is. If it's Horace Greeley, for example, he's not going to be dressed like Andrew Johnson. He's not going to be dressed like, say, Ulysses S. Grant. He's going to be dressed like people knew Horace Greeley was. He's going to have his pants stuck into the tops of his boots. He's going to be wearing a white hat and a white coat out there, because these are characteristic markers. In other words, it seems to me that around 1860, you begin to have cartoonists that realize that you can use cartoons to actually not just show that people got funny faces. I mean, what do you do with the fact they got funny faces? But to give some idea of what the character of that person is. And so you look at, say, at Thomas Nast when he's pleased with Grant, and his Grant looks noble and stately and bearded and is shown as a bulldog or as a lion, or something of that kind. And then you look at Grant in the very few where Nast doesn't approve of him, and it's the same man, but he looks shabby, he looks seedy, and maybe as if he's still recovering from having had several too many. I mean, character is out there, which means that in that sense, cartoons have been evolving over time, and in many ways getting much better at telling us, just if you immediately looked at it, whether you like this person or not, which in the lithographs you couldn't do. I mean, it just wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me add, I won't take any, I'll have one more question for you.
Whatever you like.
One big question.
Yeah.
Thomas Nast, you've mentioned him several times. That's sort of the thrust we're going with. Mm-hmm. Why is he the center, sort of the gravity point for American political cartoons? We've been around, we've been a sovereign nation for almost 250 years now. Lots of political commentary in that time, but he seems to be the center point around when people talk political cartoons. He's the one that comes up. Why is that?
About two good reasons, beyond the one that he's one of the few that actually realizes what you can do with caricature to show somebody the person's personality. One of the best argument things is he actually has a forum that nobody else has. The magazine he works for, Harper's Weekly, comes out every week, which means that instead of, like the lithographic cartoons that only come out during a political campaign and aren't about daily events, his cartoons increasingly are going to be a comment on the events going on right at that time, which means that all at once he becomes something that political cartoonists are going to become, and that you're going to have from that point on. You don't have that before that. That's a pretty critical kind of thing. The second thing is that his cartoons, it has to be said, become vitally important because he has an enormous fund of his own ideas, and his own ideas out there are based on literature. I mean, he knows his Shakespeare, inside out. He knows his Aesop and other kind of fables and so on. And he has a very intense and very personal moral viewpoint. which means that he actually has an identity that most cartoonists up till that point did not have. And that identity is the cartoonist giving his own opinion about what events are and having a very strong idea of those events. That makes a difference. But that ability, that literary ability out there to draw on things like Roman arenas, for example, and visions of kings and things of the immediate day are one reason that one of the other great cartoonists of the 19th century would say, Nast has done just about everything. And all the way to the present day, there are cartoonists that take seminal Nast cartoons and they update them to the present and they use them again in their own work, knowing pretty well that this is the one cartoonist from the 19th century that some of the people that look at their cartoons may recognize. The famous one of Boss Tweed standing there with the head being made of a bag of money. I mean, you've seen this you've seen this image on book covers and the rest, and it's used over and over again. It could be said. The other thing is the final thing about this, and I feel like the Spanish Inquisition said we have three main objects, is that Nast also creates a lingua franca that's lasted to the present day. He may not have created, but he certainly popularized the democratic donkey. He definitely created the Republican elephant. He put a beard on Uncle Sam, and he created the image of Santa Claus that we've got to the present day. And that comes out of Nast. You look at that, that's where Nast's importance comes from. And it's a tragedy about this man that ultimately, by the end of his life, he is so much seen as a has-been that he no longer can be a cartoonist, and he ends his life as a consul in Ecuador, where he dies of yellow fever. In, I think, 1902, something like that. It's a very sad end for this really remarkable man.
Well, Dr. Summers, that is all the time we have today. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed chatting with you. Your passion, your knowledge tell me that you're the professor that we all want to take. So
you're very kind.
Thank you so much. So our next guest is Mr. Michael Kahn, who has done a lot of things. He is a lawyer by trade, but he also has a fascination with political cartoons, and he's going to share with us some of the stories of Thomas Nast. Mr. Kahn is very interesting because he is an avid collector, and so he understands not just the importance of the cartoons, but how they were published, the technologies available. So he has some really fascinating information for us. Let's talk to Mr. Kahn. Hello, everyone. We are excited to be doing this broadcast about political cartoons, specifically, including those of Thomas Nast. And anyone who's had an American history textbook has probably seen at least one of his cartoons. And we have here someone with us today who is a student of political cartoons and a collector themselves. Mr. Kahn, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in political cartoons?
Sure. I have always been interested in history, and I especially interested in the American presidency. And I got a book by a man named Stephen Laurent, and it covered all the presidents up to the time that I studied it. And every one of them was illustrated with political cartoons. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. It's really a fun way to express things. And then I was at UCLA, was taking a semester in Washington, D.C., from a course from a professor who was very famous. He actually was the administrative assistant to Sam Rayburn for many, many years. And we were in his home, covered with a lot of books, and he pointed to this cartoon on the wall. And he said, this cartoon decided the election of 1884. The reason that Grover Cleveland was president was because of this cartoon. And I thought to myself, wow, that's really cool. And I looked at the cartoon, and it was a beautiful cartoon, beautiful color with lots of images of people, and I was hooked. And since then, I've collected cartoons. I've actually collected thousands of books and probably as many as 1 million images in my collection, following this theme of looking at politics through cartoons.
You know, we sort of skipped to the end at the beginning, talking about how a political cartoon determined the outcome of a presidential election. But you've studied so many of these. Take us back a little bit and sort of give us an idea of how influential just political cartoons can be in swaying the American public in politics and elections, or in the legislative process and all those things.
Well, let me give you an indicator of the impact of political cartoons. Political cartoonists all around the world today are in jail. Political cartoons all around the world in repressed countries like Iran and like Russia and like China and other places are prohibited or extremely restricted. In many cases, places like North Korea, political cartoons are prohibited. Why do you think that is? That's because cartoons are influential. They make an impact on people. They scare dictators. They scare leaders. In fact, it's a sign of the freedom of a country, how robust the political cartoons are, how willing the public, the leaders are to allow cartoons about them. And when a good cartoon hits, inevitably politicians scream and yell and sue to get them prevented. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, there was a governor who didn't like a cartoon. I think he was published like I think it was a parrot or something. And so he had a law passed that you couldn't portray somebody looking like an animal. So then the cartoonist then went and made him look like a fruit. And the politician realized that that was an endless thing that he could probably not win, and he gave up. But there are many, many examples of American politicians who become very offended by the cartoons and try to suppress them because they're so influential, they're so powerful. And just another couple of examples, some of the most famous campaigns in America, Watergate Campaign. We remember a lot about the Watergate Campaign of going after, with Woodward and the like, going after Nixon. But really the beginning of it was a cartoonist named Paul Conrad, and from the Los Angeles Times, and he published a series of cartoons about Nixon and his cronies, very famous cartoons, which were published all around the United States, which galvanized public opinion against Nixon and really pointed out the corruption that Nixon was surrounded by. And one final example, after Hiroshima in the late 1940s, there was a lot of discussion about the use of the atom bomb. People thought, gee, this is a cool new weapon. Why don't we try to use it? And some people were quite alarmed by that, about how dangerous the atom bomb was. But a cartoonist named Herbert Bloch, who was very famous also for fighting McCarthy, developed a person named Mr. Atom. And he put it in a cartoon, and there was a series of cartoons. And of course, the whole idea was that Mr. Atom looked very friendly and very nice, but he was actually the most dangerous thing on the planet. And it was a very effective way to remind people that Mr. Atom was quite a dangerous thing and you had to be scared of it.
So you mentioned Thomas Nast, and lots of people have become very familiar with the American political process. Like I said, they're in American history textbooks in middle school, high school, and especially in college. But it seems like the ones they really focus on tend to be those Nast cartoons. What can you put your finger on what exactly it was about him, his style, the medium that has made him stand out over time?
I think there are a couple of things. First of all, there was the fact that he was identified so much with the North Side and Lincoln in the Civil War, and it was a real point of view. And during the Civil War, there was a lot of different controversy. People don't remember or realize this, but in the North, there was great controversy about the Civil War. Mm-hmm. There were a great number of people in the North who didn't think the Civil War was a good idea, that wanted to compromise with the South. And there was a sort of a raging press controversy about the Civil War in the North. And Nast became the leader, the voice, the cartoon voice of Lincoln and the Union cause. And I think that early identification was something that made Nast stand out.
Are those political cartoons that we have today, or even 10 or 20 years ago, as, in your opinion, at least, as impactful as the ones that we think of from that late 19th and early 20th century period?
I don't think they're as universally impactful. That is to say, I don't think any particular cartoonist has a national impact anymore. Not in this country. In other countries, they do. In other countries, there are leading cartoonists and leading newspapers that still have the function. But here we have such a diffuse media that most of the cartoonists are local. There are some that are nationally syndicated, but they really don't have the impact. I mean, Doonesbury has an impact, but it's a different kind of genre. Doonesbury's more about his story. Doonesbury is one of the rare political cartoonists, if you will, who you don't actually understand the cartoon until you read the dialogue. A really good cartoon is about something you just look at the picture and you know what it means. So I do think it's less. Now, cartoons themselves actually are much more influential. The graphic novels are really cartoons, and manga and things like that. Graphic novels have become an enormous form of communication, and many cartoonists switched to graphic novels. And there have been graphic novels about the Holocaust by a guy named Art Spiegelman, but very, very influential. So the cartoon as a vehicle, and even a cartoon about political things, as it were a political cartoon, is more influential in different ways, more educational and less impactful.
Folks, you can tell we're talking to an expert, such an expert that he has actually published a book. Can you tell us just a little bit about your book and the process you went through to choose a finite amount of cartoons to sort of be the defining part of the published book?
Well, I published 3 of them.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. The first one was on the Supreme Court. I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for my whole career. And so I published a book about the Supreme Court and the Constitution. And it's called May It Amuse the Court. That I went about. I personally collected as many cartoons as I could. And then I ran into a professor. I was sort of in the community of collectors, and I talked about doing this. And I ran into a professor named Harry Pullman, who teaches at Dickinson University. And he had worked at the Supreme Court for Justice Rehnquist. And Rehnquist had him collect cartoons about the Supreme Court. And so he and I merged our collections, and we wrote this book. And it was pretty easy because, surprisingly, there aren't that many cartoons about the Supreme Court and Supreme Court issues. Things like Brown versus the Board of Education, stuff like that, there were more than less, but we didn't have that many. So that was pretty easy. And then I published a book about Puck magazine, and that was much harder because it had all these beautiful cartoons for 50 some years. We collected all the cartoons that we could on these subjects from the magazine, and we tried to select the best. Well, one thing I did, I have a collection of secondary sources. Actually, a lot of them are back of me. You can see books about political cartoons. And what I did was I took all the cartoons from those books and as sort of the famous ones, and we tried to use the famous ones as lead cartoons, so ones that you'd be familiar with. So I picked the famous ones and then the ones that popped, that really spoke to me. And that's how I did it. Then the final book I published, I did a big exhibit at a library called the Grolier Library in New York. And that was the most fun because I published cartoons. It was a book about my collection. And there I picked the ones that I liked the most, which basically are the ones that I think you would like, because they're the ones where you look at them and you know immediately. They just jump out. And somebody once asked me, "What's a great cartoon?" And I said, "Here's what a great cartoon. A great cartoon is a cartoon you look at and your first words are, 'Hey, Sally,' you yell to your wife, 'come and look at this.' That's a great cartoon."
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Mr. Kahn. It has been a pleasure, and we will look forward to talking to you soon again.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye. So, folks, in a nutshell, that's Thomas Nast and what one could call the peak of political cartoons. I highly encourage you to go look this up. All you've got to do is type him into Google. The ones we've shown you is just the tip of the iceberg. He has hundreds and hundreds of illustrations. It helps to have a little bit of context with the time, so I highly encourage you to read a little bit about Reconstruction, about Boss Tweed, about the Gilded Age, to understand the times that he was doing his work in a little bit better. But when you do, you're going to see that there is a reason that Thomas Nast is still with us today, and in almost every American history textbook, you're going to see a lot of Nast cartoons. So thanks for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed this members-only live stream. Thank you for being a member and supporting all the great programs and all the great things we do with education, preservation, and conservation. Until we see you again here online or at the History Center Live, stay safe and take care.